Welcome to Breaking Down Patriarchy. I'm Amy McPhie Allebest. Today I'd like to start by reading some song lyrics, which say, "My senses made me stronger. I'm a fighter who can push right through. Pushing forward, seeing things that no one else can see. My passion knows no bounds. Yes, this is me. This is me. This is me. I'm creative, hard to see. I freak out, but I'm brave, and I'm proud of that. They say my autism gives me chains. They say it hurts my family. But my autism sets me free, because this is me." These inspirational lines, which challenge us to rethink our understanding of autism, are sung by a young woman named Mia, who is the protagonist of the book Speak Up. This amazing, encouraging, and joyful graphic novel follows Mia, a middle school girl with autism, as she and her best friend invent an alter ego, the music sensation LQ. And we get to follow what happens when their make believe musician finds very real success. It's a story about friendship and family and about finding pride in yourself. And I'm so excited to be discussing it today with the author and illustrator of Speak Up, Rebecca Burgess. Welcome, Rebecca.
Hi. Hello.
It's so great to have you today. And I'll just start with kind of like a professional bio so listeners can get to know who you are, and then you can tell your own story after that. Rebecca Burgess is a freelance illustrator currently living in Bristol, England. Their favorite things are nature, history, comics, psychology, and cuddling their girlfriend. Rebecca is most well known for their various long and short comics that explore and explain autism. Their comics are known for showing big feelings and lovable characters that people can Their comics are known for showing big feelings and lovable characters that people can connect to on a personal level. And today we'll be discussing their most recent book, which Rebecca both wrote and illustrated, Speak Up. So, Rebecca, could you tell us a bit more about yourself and your personal background, from like where you're from and what brought you to do the work that you do now?
Yeah, I'm from the UK. Like I said, in Bristol, southwest based. Um, and I got into comics just because I've like loved drawing my whole life, like literally since I was like tiny, probably like 3 years old or something. And I mainly got into comics through manga because, like, comics aren't really a big thing in the UK. Like, even now, they're not a huge thing. Like, my comics are bigger in America than they are here. Like, in
Oh,
America, you get
really?
like shelves and shelves of comics,
Yeah.
but in the UK, you like if you go to a big bookshop, you get like one little shelf with maybe like 20 comics on it. So it's very different over
Oh.
here. But we have huge shelves of manga. So so like
Hmm.
I grew up reading Japanese comics. And the great thing about Japanese comics is that you get like such a wide range of genres for like all kinds of people. So like growing up as a girl, like manga was very appealing because we had a lot of found a lot of comics that were aimed at teenage girls, and I feel like that's my main influence for my storytelling. And then I started making comics when I was 13, and then selling them at comic conventions. That's where the comics are big in the UK, is like small press comic conventions where everyone just makes it themselves because publishers won't do it. And then I've just been doing that for
Huh.
like for years and years. And then I finally got
Oh,
an
that's
agent
really
at some
interesting.
point in America, and now now I can do it full time.
Awesome. So I wonder if we can start really basic, if we're talking specifically about Speak Up, this book, start really basic and establish some definitions for listeners who might have heard these terms before, but maybe they aren't sure exactly what they mean. So could you start by defining three words? First, autism. Second, neurotypical. And then third, neurodivergent. And of course, if there's any other vocabulary that you'd like listeners to know, we can include that as well. But first, yeah, autism, neurotypical, and neurodivergent.
So autism is quite hard to define because it like encompasses a lot of different things, but it's basically
Mhm.
like the label that you put on someone whose brain kind of I mean, this is the same for neurodivergent as well, to be honest, but someone whose brain functions differently. Like with autism, it's categorized generally by like how well you socialize, your talking skills, especially when you're younger, sensory issues, which is kind of like if you're very sensitive to things like light and touch and taste, and also the other way around, like on the opposite end as well, if you're like very unsensitive and like say just like can't even feel if you've hurt yourself, things like that. So yeah, there's like loads of different aspects, and you kind of like cluster them together into like just the
Mhm.
term autism spectrum, which is why it's a spectrum, which people normally get mixed up about, where people think it's sort of like you're either very autistic or not autistic at all. But spectrum more refers to the fact that people who are autistic might have like some of the stuff I've talked about, and then not like experience other stuff, like a neurotypical person. So yeah, that's my very complicated way to say. I should probably say like the stereotypical way,
No,
but I know it too well, so I can't like describe it the way that maybe people would expect it to be described. um,
no, that's great. Thank you.
and then neurotypical kind of refers to basically like the majority of the population, you could say. So, like the typical way in which people operate, like the way that your brain operates, basically. Um, and then if you think about neurodivergent, in contrast to that, neurodivergent is basically like all the various kinds of people that operate in a different way. And there's lots of things that fall into that. Like a nice, easy one to think about is probably dyslexia would be considered neurodivergent in the sense that, like, the majority of the population can learn to read and write in this like the standardized way that we teach people in school, and then there'll be a small amount of people that have to learn different ways to read and write. Therefore, they are neurodivergent. And then you have various things under that scope, such as ADHD, autism, dyspraxia, dyscalculia. Just like it's just like different ways that your brain works that impacts how you interact with the world and how you interact with other people.
That's great. Thanks so much. Okay, so my next question for you, and this is kind of combining, I first asked you kind of your life story, where you're from and what brought you to the work you do, and then you defined some of these terms. And then obviously, the story that you're telling in your book is about a main character with autism. And I'd love to start by hearing you tell what your own experiences have been with autism, and especially like while you were growing up. I'd love to know when you discovered your own autism and what that experience was like. Did that inform the character of Mia in the book?
Yeah, it definitely informed the book a lot. Like she's mostly just like me when I was 13. um, But I didn't know I was autistic until I was older, because I'm just old enough that it was kind of underdiagnosed. Basically, unless you were non-verbal. When I was growing up, I think the only people that were really majority of people that were diagnosed were non-verbal. So that it was picked up when you were tiny. But yeah, I wasn't diagnosed until I was in my 20s. But I always kind of knew I was different, but I didn't really understand why. And I felt quite embarrassed about how I experienced stuff. I generally felt like I was too sensitive, and getting everything wrong, and that all the problem hurdles that I face were my problem, and not just the not something that I couldn't help. Um, yeah, and I had a lot of problems growing up. I think the main problems I had maybe like a lot of bullying when I was a kid, because I just really wasn't. I mean, I still I just like operate on a different level socially. maybe take people too literally, I think. And people, I think, don't take me literally enough. So I'll just say exactly what I'm thinking, but some people
Mm,
will want to look into it more than there is and then take things the wrong way. And also, if you're just like, when you're a kid in school, if you're a
mm,
bit different, then I think kids just don't know what to do with that. And then they'd start bullying you because they're not quite sure what else to do. Like, I don't think it generally comes from a bad place because children are just children. Like, they're not being mean on purpose, rarely. But you become an easy target if you're very different. Yeah, and I wrote Speak Up because I wanted to see characters like me, like main characters that were like me, and I wanted kids to autistic kids to read it and kind of like feel okay with like being too sensitive or finding normal situations that everyone else seems to find so easy and they find them hard. I want them to like see that in a book, but in like a fun, entertaining book. And then it will kind of like make them feel better about themselves rather than like feel really self conscious about it. I feel like that was the main driver for the book. And it's achieved that because loads of kids and parents have written me about this. So it's definitely achieved its purpose.
that's wonderful. Well, it two things occurred to me as you were talking about that. First of all, how powerful and inspiring it is that you said like you didn't see main characters in books that would have benefited you as you were growing up. And so you created it, right? Like you saw this lack and
Yeah.
so you decided to do something about it. You created it yourself. That's just really beautiful and empowering for anybody hearing this. And then the other thing is sorry, now I just lost my train of thought. Hold on. Oh, and then the sorry. And then the other thing is how important it is um, that a person with autism is the one writing the book with the main character with autism. Can you speak to that a little bit? Like, have you read any books where it's a person who isn't autistic writing about people who are autistic? And does that feel a little off to you? I wonder about I imagine that it is a really powerful thing to have someone be writing from their real lived experience.
Yeah, I definitely feel like my favorite books with autistic characters are ones that have been written by autistic people, like
Mm.
a kind of spark. Like when I read that, I just kind of felt like, I don't know if you know that it's a kind of quite a big kids book over here, children's book with an
Mm.
autistic main character. And that just felt like therapy reading that. But
Mm.
I've also read what's it called? Curious Instant of the Dog in Nighttime is quite a famous one
Yes.
from quite a long time ago now. And that maybe not so much, because I think I've I find this especially with I've seen a lot of TV series with um, autistic characters. I think if you're not autistic, you tend to, I think, must just misunderstand some of our behaviors, which is like totally understandable. Like I can see why you would if you can't like climb inside someone's brain and figure it out. But they do gets like really misconstrued. I feel like the most common thing maybe is just this idea that we don't have any feelings, which I find
Mm.
really strange. But like that's like a
Mm.
really common one. Even like things with the Good Doctor, which I enjoyed it, but it did have this common problem where the main character was like, I don't know how to feel things. I am like a robot, and like that's just not. I haven't met a single autistic person like that. Like sometimes I've met some people who take a little while to recognize what they're feeling. But that's very different to I don't have any feelings, which is
Yeah.
very much how it can come across a lot of the time. And just because someone has an odd way of speaking or isn't very good navigating relationships, it's normally just because the way that our brain works means that our tone of voice is different, and we have difficulty navigating relationships normally just because it's almost like you're speaking a different language to each other. So there's just lots of misunderstanding, but it's not, you still feel everything inside. We've still got
Yeah.
feelings. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah,
just one
thank
example, but there's a few things like that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I learned a phrase, and maybe I'm kind of late to learn this, but I heard a phrase just like in the last year from a person who actually runs a big center and specifically works with people with autism. And the phrase is "nothing about us without us." And that
Okay.
really, really struck me, like the power of how important it is to make sure that people are able to speak for themselves and not have an outside group come in and assume that they know and speak for them. So, I mean, I
Mm,
imagine that goes in everything from literature, like you're describing, like stories, like The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, or the media that you said. And I'm guessing even in like the medical and scientific community of people going in and speaking for people and speaking incorrectly, even as you said, with
yeah,
good
I think
intentions.
that phrase is yeah, the phrase has very much been coined for the medical situations because it's still. I mean, I still hear some awful stuff like people who are
Mm,
restrained for no
mm,
reason, and they're restrained because they're misinterpreted. If you have a meltdown, say you're misinterpreted as someone that's going to like be dangerous, but it's almost like the worst thing you could do is. I mean, I'm not sure about restraining people anyway, but the worst thing you could do is restrain someone who, like, the reason that they're having a meltdown is normally because you're overstimulated. So I can't, like, restraining isn't going to, like, stop them or calm them down. It's just going to make it worse and just make the whole situation more stressful.
yeah.
So you can't, like, that nothing without us, that phrase is very much like stop treating us like animals. Just because you communicate in a different way doesn't mean it's like you're not a human being.
Hmm.
You need to listen to us.
Yeah. Well, tell us about this book, Rebecca, and how it came to be. Why did you feel compelled to write and draw this novel? And then I'd love to hear what the responses have been like since its release.
I feel like I covered this a bit before, but yeah, I mainly wrote it because I didn't see anything like this when I was a kid. I just wanted something really fun. I'd read previously a lot of depressing stuff about autism, where it's sort of like a sob story, like,
Mm.
oh, how terrible it is to have this disease called autism. And I wanted something that was like really fun, and like light-hearted. I mean, it, obviously, Speak Up gets quite emotional, and it tackles uh, some stuff, and it like creates some talking points, but it's kind of like wrapped up in like a fun Hannah Montana kind of story. So,
Mhm.
and like an addictive
Mhm.
drama kind of story, like just something that has all the twists and turns of like a normal kid story where like where you just want to keep going was the point of it. Um, and yeah, like I think, like I said before, just to kind of like make kids just feel good about themselves. And like I said before, like I've got really good responses from it. I get emails all the time from parents and kids, just saying how much they loved it, how much they saw themselves in it. I went to a comic convention this weekend, and like literally the second person that I saw that morning, like the convention opened at like 10:15 in the morning, at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then at 10:15, this mum came over who was from Canada, and she told me that her daughter was autistic, picked up the book in like a Scholastic fair, and like read it within an hour, like just read it in one setting, and then immediately came
Mm,
up to her and was like, "This is amazing! Like I see myself in these
mm.
pages. Like we need to read this together." And then they were reading it together, and it made her mum think about whether she was autistic as well, and then she kind of like made her own discoveries through that as well. It was
Wow.
very touching.
Oh, that's awesome. That's so
It
great.
was
I love
amazing.
that. So great.
But yeah, that happens sometimes, and that's really nice. That's what I want. Just want to help
Fantastic.
people.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna ask you too, like you said, oftentimes we only hear negative stories about autism or kind of like it's like cast in this tragic light. And I'd like to have you continue to challenge that. And you have already in the conversation, but I'd love to hear some of like a few of your favorite things about autism and being autistic.
I feel like my favorite thing about it is maybe yeah, quite a lot of things, but like probably the biggest thing is maybe like I'm very passionate. Like I'm like absolutely obsessed with some stuff. They call it hyperfixations, and it really does go quite a bit beyond normal. I think because like life can be so stressful for me that if you find something that you really love, you kind of like really attach yourself to it in a different way because it just like makes everything better. And thankfully, because like the thing that I love is drawing, it means that I'm very productive. I'm very prolific compared to some people I know. Like I make a lot of stuff. I do this full time, which is very. It means I'm very self motivated. It is quite hard to be a freelancer
Mm,
if you don't have the motivation, which is like totally fine. I think that's understandable. But yeah, I feel like I have that on my side, and I also just like um, because I'm quite hypersensitive to stuff. I think I just notice a lot of stuff that other people don't seem to notice.
mm,
But like nice things. Like I notice not nice things, but I notice lots of lovely things as well. Like like just the way that the trees are moving in the
mm.
light or something like that. Like nice little things that make everyday life more magical, I guess.
That's beautiful. Wow. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's really amazing. So,
Yeah.
throughout the book, Mia is regularly at odds with her mother, who is a very well meaning but kind of a misunderstanding character. She tries her best to help Mia fit in and she encourages her to socialize and to act like the other kids, but that requires her hiding pieces of who she really is, right? So she kind of, the mother, even though she's trying really hard probably to protect Mia, she does see Mia's autism as a burden. And it's really heartbreaking to watch this. She's a single mother and she just has nothing but the best intentions for her daughter and is trying to keep her safe, but it's very clearly causing harm. So I'm wondering if you can talk about what guidance you would have for parents who maybe have recently learned that their child is autistic or suspect that they might be. How can we avoid the mistakes of the mother in your story?
I think probably the first thing is to probably be careful about what information you read online. Like I think probably better to get information from books and buy books that are by autistic authors because there's loads of informational books now, like both aimed towards kids and adults, um, that have been written by autistic people that and they have that childhood experience that they just have the hindsight to know like what really works for children and what doesn't. And there's like really good books out there now about this. So definitely look at that rather than the internet, because obviously the internet kind of like siphons itself off into like different extremes. and you can get really confusing advice, like different advice, depending on like just which area you happen to stumble upon when you're looking at this stuff, and then both sides can be a bit extreme, and then you can't find like a good middle ground that's maybe like a little less scary or confusing. So get some books. I've illustrated a book for kids recently called Being Autistic, and what that actually means is like that's literally the title. Written by someone that writes guidebooks for autistic people. And we made this one specifically for like primary school age, so like the kind of age where you might just either find out from your parents that you're autistic or be recently diagnosed. And apparently, it's like been really helpful so far. So like, I think that's a good start. And like, look at the author. I don't know how to pronounce her name because she has an Irish name, and I'm really bad at pronouncing Irish names, I'm afraid. Look up the book and then look up the author at her other books.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Well, in your
um,
book too, because you mentioned that the mother who came up to you from Canada at the convention and
Oh
said
yeah, I
that
don't know
reading
because
your
mine's not
book really helped
informational.
her,
It's just
right?
like a fictional book. I don't feel like that's really good in that sense because like it's only showing one experience and not kind of like covering everything. And then I think from like this academic kind of advice, I think maybe just like be patient. Like don't push your kids if they because sometimes you're in a situation with your parent where like you know that a kid will benefit from doing something, but they're just not doing it. I mean, situations like either like social situations, like going out more or doing something new or like trying more healthy food, things like that, that could be really difficult if you're autistic. Um,
Mm,
and parents get into a situation where like you're really worried about the kids, and so you'd start like really trying to push them to do it. And but I think unfortunately when you're autistic it just stresses you out more. It just really stresses you
mhm,
out, and you just dig your heels in. Like we're too stubborn, unfortunately. And pushing doesn't really work. And it just makes sort of these traumatic situations, and something like trying to eat more healthy can turn into an eating disorder. So like it's better to like not worry too much and like let them go at their own pace, because you will get to the point that they will get to the point that you want most of the time, but you really need to like let a kid go at their own pace, basically, even if it's not at the same pace that other kids are going at, but just let them take the path their own way and they will find their way.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's reassuring, I'm sure, for parents to hear. That's really hard as parents, it really is, but it
Mm.
reminds me, of the next question that I was gonna ask, which is just especially if it's a parent who is not autistic and then has an autistic child, and you referred to this earlier in our conversation too, of just misunderstanding what the autistic person is trying to communicate to you, right? And I know in your book, a lot of Mia's struggles also seem to stem from misunderstandings, like with her classmates who would interpret things like not making eye contact or being quiet as being rude. And so I guess my next question would be, what could we be teaching our children who aren't autistic to help them be more supportive of their autistic peers and classmates?
um yeah, I think maybe just like approach like kids that you think are strange, and then maybe like teach kids to react to it in a different way. So like rather than, because I think kids' automatic reaction is to basically like shy away from a kid that's different to them. But I feel like something you could teach is to just like be curious. Like if you don't understand a kid, like ask them questions, or just try and play with them in a different way, like be creative and be curious, you know. I feel like that's a nice simple way to approach it with a kid. So that, because
Mhm.
everyone is different in different ways, so it can be quite complicated. But like if you're those two things, like creative and curious, then I think you can kind of like make friends with people that you maybe weren't expecting to make friends with, you know. And that's the
Mhm.
best you can do, is just make
Yeah.
friends with each other.
I love that, and that's great advice across the board for any differences that we encounter, and
Yeah.
actually, not just for children, but all the way through adulthood, right?
Yeah,
Still
yeah,
have
that's
that
true. That's true.
right?
Yeah.
Curiosity and compassion and empathy, yeah,
Yeah.
that's such good advice. And it occurs to me too, again, like, just thinking about little kids, and you were so lovely at the beginning, even talking about your own experience with bullying, which is so hard and so painful, and you were so gracious in your willingness to give the benefit of the doubt to children and just say, I think most of the time children are not meaning to be cruel. They don't know. They're just kids. That was very gracious of you. But one thing that I thought of is how important it is also for the autistic child to have a vocabulary too, to explain like, "Oh,
Yeah.
I'm autistic. You might notice this," and I think your book and all of the literature that is being produced helps everybody, right, to have a common vocabulary so that, as soon
Mm.
as possible, people grow up being able to describe themselves. People then come to a conversation and think, "Oh, I've heard of that. Oh, yeah, tell me more about it." And people can talk about it more easily.
I never thought about it that way, but it's a very good point. That's a really good point.
Okay, another question that might not be as obvious, but that I'm really curious to hear your answer to. Um, I'd love to hear how patriarchy uniquely affects the autistic community. What would be some challenges that you see most often with people with autism bump kind of butting up against that have to do with patriarchy?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is widely talked about in the autistic community. Is there's such a severe underdiagnosis of girls, um, in the with autism, and it's very much like it's definitely because of patriarchy, because like the medical
Mm.
system is, I mean, we've got these other problems, right? Where medical issues around the reproductive system, right, have been completely underlooked, because when men are running the medical system, it's just sort of like we don't care, and it's kind of the same thing with autism, where for a very long time it was only really looked at in boys. And then just this weird, and it's weird because like I think most of us can see why, but how it's happened, but for some reason the medical community like continues to ignore it. But basically, I mean, it's very sociological, I guess. Sorry, it's a little hard to explain. But if you're like
You're doing a
raised a
great
boy,
job.
you're kind of like you're like if you're raised a boy, you're raised to kind of be more vocal, um, like put yourself out there more, like not worry so much about consequences. Don't be meek. Don't like hide yourself. Things like that. So of course, naturally, if you're autistic, and then at the same time raised to just be like, just do whatever you want, and like don't worry about the consequences, then like then the problems that you might face are going to be more out in the open. Whilst if you're socialized to be a girl, then it tends to be like, be quiet, like sit down, be quiet, don't ask questions, all this kind of stuff. And it gets interpreted in a very different way. And then it means that if you're autistic and raised a girl, then first of all you're already from like a really, really early age learning to just hide who you are, and you're learning these skills that all girls I think are taught from a very, very like like literally from the age of 2.5, to just like hide yourself. So then you learn much more easily how to hide problems that you're having and how to navigate social problems in a more subtle way, because girls are also from a ridiculously early age taught social language, like emotional language, that boys from a very early age aren't taught. If if you're socialized one way or the other. Um, and yeah, and then it comes out in all these ways, so that for a long time, um, autism was considered only a male thing. Like the person, in the main person studying autism in the UK, for quite a long time. I can't remember his name, but he had this theory that it's a really stupid theory in my opinion, but he had this theory that, like, if you have a male brain, then you're more likely to get autism, and if you have a female brain, then you're less likely to get it. But I think all of that is
Mm,
bullshit anyway. Like, all this gender stuff is just, like, it
mm,
doesn't really make any sense when you like take apart gender. Um, but yeah, because he was like running the show for a very long time, he then the way that he diagnosed people was completely built around male stereotypes, and even the screening tool, even now, that you get for autism, like the sort of main screening tool that you might find online if you're trying to decide whether you're autistic, we have these really silly questions that are very male orientated, as in, like, things like, oh, when you were a child, were you really interested in trains, or did you really like math? And the problem with those kind of questions,
mm,
obviously, is I mean, it already kind of cuts out literally anyone that doesn't like math or trains, but it even more so,
mhm.
like, cuts out someone who's socialized to be a girl, because, like, again, if you're socialized to be a girl at the moment, you have this, still got this problem now where you're kind of like discouraged from doing things like math or being interested in trains. And then it would just like completely go under the radar. Like, an autistic girl might have a absolute obsession with boy bands, like a really, like, undying obsession with boy bands, but because it's boy bands and not math, people will be like, well, that's not autism, you know. You like boy
Oh,
bands, but
interesting.
you're not
Wow.
obsessed with dinosaurs or trains or math, so, like, you couldn't be autistic. So so
Hmm.
that's how you got this
Wow.
underdiagnosis for a long time. It's like changing more recently because people have started talking about it. But I think that's quite a good example of how patriarchy has
Mhm.
affected that. It's probably like the biggest problem. I hope
Yeah.
that made
Thank you
sense.
for that. It did. Definitely. No, that definitely did. Yeah, thank you for that. I'm curious if that played a part in your own path, because you mentioned that you went quite a while without being diagnosed. Do you think that was at play at all for you
Yeah,
personally?
I would think so. I would assume so. And also because my mum's a therapist and a psychologist, so, like, I was equipped very
Oh.
early with understanding my feelings and emotions and, like, the language for that. And that's another thing that for quite a long time, like up until recently, you would kind of like people would say, like, oh, if I can't diagnose you with autism because, like, you understand your feelings too much, or, like, you have feelings. So
Oh.
and I probably, more than like the average person, are quite good at that, literally just because of how we've been brought up in a family environment. But
Interesting. I
that
wonder
also
if
comes
that
into the
also
girl thing,
skews.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, sorry, there's a little bit of a lag, sorry about that. Yeah, I was gonna say, I wonder if that also skews because boys are socialized to not have as much facility identifying their
Mm.
emotions and expressing their emotions, and so that might kind of artificially reinforce that conception that boys, it would get more boys diagnosed, I would think, if they have that misperception of
Yeah.
autistic kids not having feelings, and then boys aren't raised to articulate their feelings. That would kind of like create kind of a cycle of
Yeah, and then any
more
boys
diagnoses of
that
boys
are
and
on
girls.
the opposite side of it, because obviously autism sort
Yeah.
of like works in extremes. So if there are
Mm,
boys that feel very sensitive and feel things very strongly, that might be because of autism, but they'll be equally going under
mm.
the radar because they're not fitting that stereotype that has been set up
Interesting.
in the medical system for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. Well, hopefully it's starting to change and will just continue to change as it's being talked about more and brought to people's attention, I hope.
Yeah, it's definitely like I'd say in like the last 6, 7 years, like definitely changing. Yeah.
Good, good, good. Okay, well, let's shift gears. I was made aware that you are the proud author of not one, but I believe at least two books, which have been
Yeah.
banned in many schools. And that is crazy to me. So
Yeah.
I'd love to hear about the other book that you wrote. What is it about? And then how how does that happen? We did an episode on how books are banned here in the United States, but how does that happen where you are, and why were your books put on the banned list in some places?
God, I don't know. Yeah. I made a book called How to Be Ace, which is just it's about asexuality. It's sort of like an autobiographical book about asexuality and my experiences with that. And I think it's just because it goes against the norm. It's bizarre. It's funny. Like I think some people, when I've told them that it's been banned, like a lot of people laugh, which I get a bit annoyed about because it's not a funny topic. It's a scary topic. But like people do find it funny because to them the idea, because if for anyone that doesn't know, like if you're asexual, then it generally means that you're not interested in sex. So the idea that a book about not being interested in sex would then get banned is very strange because generally the reason people assume that the reason that books are banned is because they're like super sexual or pornographic or
Hmm.
like dangerous to children in some kind of way. We all have different opinions about that. But I
Hmm.
think probably my book is probably quite a good example of how the reasons that people are banning books isn't maybe for the reason that they might be uh, saying to the public, this narrative of like it's dangerous for children and they're going to be hypersexualized very early when they look at all this LGBT stuff. It's going to like rot their minds and they're going to see it too soon and all this kind of rhetoric that I've seen. But the fact that they're banning books about not having sex and the kind of it sort of like goes against the dangers that they're warning against, because if you ban a book that's letting people know basically that it's okay to not have sex if you feel very uncomfortable with that. If you ban books like that, then you're kind of doing the opposite of what you say you want to protect. And
Hmm.
I think probably says a lot about the real reasons that people want to ban these books. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. And why was Speak Up banned? Because that one too, that one I was kind of baffled by. What are the reasons that you've heard?
I'm going to assume, because I haven't looked into it. I've just like seen it on like lists and libraries. But I
Mm.
think maybe it's because one of the characters in it is non-binary. But it's not like talked about. Like it's just sort of there. Like it's just there. They're just there as part of the story, and it's not really addressed. So I think some people
Wow.
probably don't notice it, and then probably the odd person has noticed it, and then got angry about it, um, and thought that
Wow.
it's dangerous for children. But yeah, it doesn't
Just
even
the
address
existence
the
of the
issue,
character.
especially.
I have a couple more questions for you, Rebecca, before we wrap up. One thing that struck me was in the introduction to the book, and you wrote that you want autistic children to feel proud of themselves and all of their good and bad experiences. And I thought that was really interesting and wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that. Why does pride in bad experiences matter also, as well as being proud of good experiences?
I think, I mean, I think with everyone, like not just autistic people, but just with everybody, if you can be okay with the fact that sometimes like you have negative feelings, that I think it just makes everything easier. And with autism specifically, I think shame was quite a big issue when I was a kid, especially like whenever I had meltdowns, I would feel so bad about it afterwards, and that it's like carried on into adult life where I still apologize for like asking for help, and I'm not very good at asking for help from people and showing my feelings.
Mm,
So I think it's important to just sort of like show things like meltdowns, but rather than frame it as like something that's inconveniencing everybody else. Like in Speak Up, I've kind of framed it as like how you experience it, which is like this is something that's completely out of my control and it's scary and horrible and it makes you feel really sick. And then like you feel really embarrassed afterwards. So like I've kind of like gone through the process of even showing the embarrassment, but then like I don't know, I kind of hope from that then a kid can read it and be like, yeah, like this is a thing that other people experience and I'm not alone in experiencing it. And the main character that experiences this, she feels scared and anxious and has meltdowns, and then but then at the same time she does all this really cool stuff and like achieves all these things that other kids haven't been able to achieve, and she ends up like being really proud of herself, and she's kind of like a special person in her own kind of way. I don't know if that makes sense, but I just
it
want
does. Yeah, it
I
does.
just want to show all of it so that kids can just sort of like just be okay with not being okay sometimes, because you know it's
Mm,
not all great, but like but that's just part of life, and it's not something you have to be ashamed of, I guess.
mm, awesome. Well, that kind of is a great segue into the last question I wanted to ask you, which is the theme of this season for on our podcast is the serenity prayer of thinking about how we can have the strength to make the changes that we can, to do the things that we can, and then the serenity to accept things that we can't change and the wisdom to know the difference. And I wondered
Oh,
if you could maybe speak to a change that you would like to see in the world. Maybe it could be in the autistic community or outside the autistic community. What are some things that we could do to make the world a better place?
oh, long list.
Yeah,
I
for
know,
me too.
sorry. It's just the times at the moment everywhere. I think maybe
Yep.
main thing is just like we were talking about like you said compassion earlier. I think compassion for me very big thing that leads my life as well. You could probably tell like the way that I describe things. I'm quite balanced. I like to look at all
Mhm,
the different points of
mhm,
view. I'd quite like it if other people did that as well. Like when you see something that gives you a visceral reaction, like rather than feel like scared or angry or standoffish, just like put it down for a minute and try and like step into the other person's shoes and be compassionate. And then maybe if everyone's like that, then you can start like having calmer conversations and finding a middle ground in like a very divisive landscape at the moment.
mhm,
Yeah.
mhm.
Does that was that worded
Yeah.
okay? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely the world I wanna live in, so thank you for that.
Yeah.
Well, Rebecca Burgess, this has been such a delight. I learned so much from you, and as my final question, I'd just love you to tell listeners and viewers where we can find your work. How can we find Speak Up? And, anyone who's listening who might be specifically interested in this topic of autism, where can we find everything that you're doing?
Yeah, if you go on my all of my social media accounts, if you go to rebeccaburgess.co.uk, that's the easiest because my social media accounts have like a weird name that I can like barely pronounce because it's just like a name I came up with years ago that I don't have to add numbers to. So, but like, yeah,
I love it. Well, we'll have those on our social media so
yeah,
people
you got
can
my.
find it.
I've got
Yeah.
loads of stuff, and like I do more comics as well. Like I do web comics with autistic characters. So if anyone's interested in like autistic, just kind of exploring those themes, then like I've got like a history comic about someone from history who was autistic. I've got like a romantasy regency romance comic with an autistic person. Got all sorts of stuff.
Wow. Amazing. Okay, so tell us one more time your website so people can find it.
rebeccaburgess.co.uk.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you again so much. I so enjoyed this conversation. Thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah, it was fun.